Here we are. Okay, here we are. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to all of you and to the people that is online looking at us. And no, I want to thank a lot to the Bristol Poverty Institute in particular for doing this encounter, this brownback lunch. Lunch. I want to thank very much Dave in particular for working on organizing this. And also I want to thank UNICEF and Enrique for being part of us. And we are happy here of receiving all of you at the new school. As part of Equity for Children Director, I want to really give the welcome, and it's really important to be all together. The new school is almost 100 years from the new school, and always the idea, the new school was the new school for social research at the beginning, and the group of people that created the university they were thinking about social justice. That was the main point in the full university along the 100 years. So we will talk about improving child and family poverty measure. That is something very related with inequality, very related with social justice. So I think that is very important. I want only to do a brief introduction that what we will have. In fact, I want to start saying something about Peter Townsend. That was the person that inspired in some way what we are doing. Peter Townsend introduced this idea of relative deprivation. Even in this discussion with Amartya Sen about absolute or relative deprivation, he was working on that. And he also introduced the idea already like 40 years ago of the consensus approach. That is to say, decided what is poverty or not poverty is not only an issue for experts. More than that, it's really an issue for the people that need suffering poverty, and for the society in general. So Peter Townsend was behind all that, and I was really give a tribute to him in this occasion because he was very important. And if we start to discuss multidimensional child poverty with him in 2001, probably, or 2002. So now it's 20 years, but it's not such a long time. And the first measure of multidimensional child poverty appeared in 2003, that now is known as the Bristol method. Yeah, but in fact, was Kim the one that was behind that, and we were working on that with UNICEF. It appeared in UNICEF 2005. From that moment to now, there are other methodologies that appear, another way of doing. But I will say, and this maybe could be part of our discussion, I will say that the other methodology follow very much the Bristol model. First, this idea that poverty is multidimensional, that in some way is linked with another concept that is basic need approach that was important in the 70s and 80s. Yeah, and all the other models use this idea of multidimensionality. The point on the multidimensional child poverty and is to link to human rights and to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Yeah, so we have a framework, we have a conceptual framework to use for this. And as I said, from there on, there were different methods and different things that I approached, but very much around that. Today, we will discuss about some of the methods, and we will listen to all of you, and we will have discussion on that. But I think that we can move to the presentation, but because I want to show the objective of the conference, and the point is that in these 20 years, some new things appeared, but also some new tools. And let me say something. We are working in a handbook on concept, measure, and policy on child poverty. And the last section is new avenues. Well, we couldn't finish because every time that we are finishing, there is a new avenue. Yeah, because appear working with georeferential, working with microdata, working with different things. So I think that let's move to the next one. Today, that's the thing that we are discussing. Yeah, we are discussing how we can have a comparable worldwide, because even that there is different method and different experience, still we don't have one measure agree on child poverty that is useful for developing countries or from the global south, from the rich countries. So that's one important thing. And the main point is why we are doing this. And we want to learn from practical intervention. So the point is to push for policy making that is informed in this data. That is something that all the people in this table that is working on that know that that step is one of the most complicated steps. And we try and we try, we fail in many times, yeah, but we continue trying, but in sometimes we have some small success, I would say. I don't know if the rest agree with me, but I think that's my feeling. After years of working on that, I said, people said to me, you work on what? Well, trying to end child poverty. I said, oh my God. Forget it. You are working on something that is, who knows, but we believe that is possible. And that's why we are trying to inform in that. And resource allocation is something very important. And we really try to eradicate poverty. So the agenda of today, and I'm moving to give the floor to you. I am starting. My name is Alberto Minujin. I will, each of you, when you talk, please introduce yourself. Yeah, okay. I don't want to do the introduction. But so we will have Joanna talking about the needs, how you perceive need. Yeah, very much relating what I said. The issue of poverty is an issue that is not for us to decide what is poverty. It's very much for the others. Yeah, and after Héctor will talk about consensual deprivation. That is a way of approaching to that. And Mary will talk about this situation in Africa countries. Björn will talk. We do a devil advocate. We will see that. I'm curious to see that. And Dave Gordon, this problem of having one measure alone, if possible, maybe it's not possible. So that's a point of discussion. And finally, Enrique will tell us what we will do in the future. also curious about all the presentation. So I will move to you.
Thank you.
As the first one. You can move here or
If I go down there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Easier.
Slides up on?
Yes.
Just press down. Yes, you just down. Next is start with yes. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Alberto, for such a useful introduction. I think it's really highlighting why it's so important to get measures of child poverty so accurate, so we can focus ourselves in the future. I've been introducing you to what's now known as the consensual method of measuring child poverty, which basically has at its core an idea of socially perceived necessities. So let's go forward from that. First of all, I think you need to quite kind of consider what is it you're trying to do when you're measuring poverty. What's the important aspects of it? Well, the most important aspect is to go beyond income and look directly at deprivations. Income gives you some indication of what you're looking at, but it doesn't really tell you the whole story. A lot of it is related to measures which aren't necessarily directly related to income, but you actually want to find out how people's lives are lived and what they're missing out on. As Alberto was saying, it's very important to reflect the experiences of both the poor and the society in which you live in. This is essentially what the core of this method does, is it actually asks people, it finds out what it is, what's important to live in that particular society at that particular time. It's very much a bottom-up rather than a top-down method. Very important also, especially if we're looking at family and child measures, is to have a system which enables you, I'm trying to get nearer, enables you to look at within the kind of household box at what effects it has on children in particular. If you just measure at a consumption level or household level, you don't actually find out how children are affected. So it's critical that your method allows you to look directly at different type members of the household, children, also women and men, but this presentation in particular, children.
Could you please share the slides? Could you please share the slides?
Sorry?
We cannot see the slides.
Well, they cannot see the slides.
Oh.
Cannot see the slides.
Thank you.
You can see them now?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Right, we've been through the first 4 points, basically. And we're now looking at the next point, which is really you need to have some kind of clear justification why the indicators you choose to measure poverty have been chosen. We'll go through this in quite a lot of detail, but it needs to have some kind of underlying theory to it, underlying thing of what concept you're actually measuring. It's important to be applicable to low, middle and high income countries. Many of the measures used for child poverty internationally are basically divisive. They apply mostly to low income countries, but they don't apply to other countries. What you basically have is a two-standard measure where high income countries use a different measure and low income countries use a basic needs, basic measure. What this tries to do is pull them all together. So you have an equitable system for measuring poverty across whatever kind of country you live in. I think that's absolutely critical as we move forward. And also, you need to be able to make some level of international comparison, and that we'll discuss. David Gordon in particular will discuss that more at the end. So, as Alberto was saying, basically the method comes from the theory of relative deprivation developed by Peter Townsend, and this basically sees poverty as relative to the society and time in which you live. Of the detailed quote from him here, it says individuals, families and groups in the population can be said to be in poverty when the lack of resources to obtain the types of diet, etc., which are customary or at least widely encouraged or approved in the society which they belong. I'd like to kind of point to two aspects of this. One is lack of resources. This isn't just income, but it could also be resources provided in other ways. It might be public resources, it might be services provided, and so it's not just an income approach. The resources are an important part of the definition, but it isn't just limited to personal individual income. And the other part is it's customary or at least widely encouraged or proved in the society which they belong. the Townsend approach was developed in the UK originally, and I think the word customary in a high-income country, customary is fine. It gives you what people are. But once you move to a low-income country, things that are important aren't necessarily customary. They're not necessarily held by everyone. So you have to move slightly away from this kind of norms-based approach to look at it at a slightly different angle. Otherwise, what's customary in a low-income country is not acceptable. Whilst it works quite well in a high-income country like the UK, it doesn't work so well elsewhere. So what we developed was this concept of socially perceived necessities. And that defines a minimal acceptable way of life by identifying what the necessities or essentials of life are. Now, the key aspect of this is it's identified by public opinion rather than the views of experts that they might feed into what items you test, or the norms of behavior. So what you do is you identify aspects of life through focus groups and things, which you then put out to the public at large through either a face-to-face survey or an online survey nowadays. When it was originally developed, it was a face-to-face survey to find out what people think are essential. Those items which the majority can afford, the majority think are necessities, or essentials, which everyone should be able to have access to, are classed as necessities. So that becomes your baseline for which you measure poverty. One other thing it does is look at whether there's a consensus between different groups in that society is what is a necessity. That's important because otherwise minorities in the society might feel themselves excluded because it's not what they regard as important isn't recognized by the majority. So that's why that last bit is included in this slide. So what dimensions are covered? Well, basically it covers any aspect of life that that's important, whether it's the social and family needs, obviously diet, that's included in any measure of poverty, basic access to food. But this approach allows you to look more detail at things like food to see whether social, how much having, say, celebrations are important, medical access, accommodation, housing, obviously, educational access, household items, financial items of the children, and utilities. We're looking here at maybe basic services such as water, electricity, heating, things like that, but also perhaps other kind of services, as you know, with low-income countries, such as having a road transport system that you can access, or quality of environment. So it's very flexible in terms of what you look at, because it actually draws on what people think are important. So it started in a survey I did back in 1983, a long time ago. This was basically the question we asked back then, which was, we asked participants for various items. Just to step back a little bit, the items were chosen out of focus groups we'd held across the country to find out what people thought was important to them. And so from those focus groups, we put forward a set of items to the public at large. So which items you think are necessary, which all adults should be able to afford, and which they should not have to do without, and items which may be desirable but are not necessary. From that, we identified the majority items which a majority thought were necessities, and that became our baseline. You obviously need to measure against that, and we asked, therefore, whether people had the item, whether they don't have it but don't want it, and whether they have it and can't afford it. Isn't quite important to allow people a level that if they choose not to have something, they're not classed as poverty because that's their choice. So that's why we have we put the second question in. So people could, if they wanted to choose it. In fact, most items, that percentage is very low, but it's there as an option. I'll just talk a little bit about the UK, where it was developed. We've now repeated this survey in 1983, 1991, in 1990 in Northern Ireland, in 2002-3, and most recently in 2012. So we have a long time run there, which we can track people's views about what is necessary and how poverty is developed in the UK using this measure. So what we found, these findings come from the 2012 survey, but actually they could have come from any of the surveys we did at any time during that period. People's views on what the most important things are have been absolutely consistent. So we have 96% see heating is important, 94% a damp-free home, and this measure is for adults, and 91% 2 meals a day. it's very important you include in your index some items that people aren't going to think are necessities, otherwise they're not making a discriminatory choice. So right at the bottom, you have things like people don't think that going out for drink fortnightly is essential, or going to the cinema, or even a dishwasher. What's important also is that the measure shows how important things which go beyond basic needs are to people, things which include their social life, their family relationships, and how much they can actually participate in the society in which they are. So you get very high ratings for things like visiting family in a hospital, very high ratings for things like celebrations on special occasions, and so on. And also, it also shows how things move with the times. So you'll get high ratings for things, washing machine things, which obviously one time many countries wouldn't be regarded as a necessity, but in the UK, they are seen as a necessity. That's partly because other options have gone. So that's and things like household contents insurance, all these kind of things, which aren't normally be included in a basic needs assessment, become seen at. They reflect what people think is important, and they're included in these assessments. We also ask them what items they think are important for children on a separate list. This is very similar, obviously, to the household list, but it has a slightly higher standard to it. And in fact, what we find is for each item, generally people think that it's more important that children have it than other people. We find that people set a higher standard for children than they do for adults. And obviously there's things here which are specifically aimed at children. So the index can look at particular things which aim at children, like books for suitable their age, or games to help them develop, or suitable place to study. These are all seen as highly important, and they're specifically aimed items that help you distinguish what's important for children and whether they're missing out on it or not. So you can do that. I talked a little earlier about whether there's a consensus about what's important. This heat map shows you actually that however you divide the population, whether it's male, female, older, younger, whatever, they have very, very similar views of what is important. Perhaps most surprisingly, to some extent, is even people divided their political views. What we have here is Conservative Party in the UK against the Labour Party in the UK. They have very similar views of what's important. It's never been tried, this survey in the US. I'd be quite interested to know whether that extended to the US or not. But I actually suspect it would, because what you're asking people is something about their lives rather than their political views, about how they think, how they operate, how they behave in society. And there you are, same exactly, is even stronger for children, the consensus. Highly long-term agreement between all groups about what children should have. You'll also see from that chart that children rate slightly higher than adults in terms of the percentages thinking of their item as necessity. Okay. As I say, the approach was developed in the UK, where many of the most essential services, like a health service, are provided free at a point of delivery. So they're not part of what you can afford because you get them anyway. And that same would apply to education. But it's very important as you move out of society, where this is the case, that you actually allow for service provision in a way which whether people can access it, whether it's available. So as this method is developed, we've looked at other non-monetary constraints. It might also be applied to leisure activities where you might be excluded for other reasons than money, because there's discrimination or whatever. So for a range of leisure activities and services, you need to ask us some slightly separate questions, which do you have it or do it? Don't have it or do it but don't want to. Don't have it but you can't afford it, which goes back to the resources question. And don't have it for any other reason, which might be that it's not actually provided in the area. The service is simply not there. So that extends the definition, the way you approach it, to be able to incorporate middle, low income countries in particular. Right, this looks very complicated, but it is, I promise you, very simple. So right at the top, is it a necessity or not? If it's yes, do they think people think it's important or not? If they say yes, if the majority says it's yes, it becomes a socially perceived necessity. Then you ask them 3 simple questions. If we have, is it a necessity? We've done that. Do you have it? And if not, why? So if you can't afford it, that counts as deprivation and counts as poverty. If it's not provided, it would be kind of service deprivation, and that would count as poverty. If you don't want it, you're not deprived. If you lack it for some other reason, and maybe social exclusion of some kind, or other discrimination, it's not a resource-based application. And this method, it's very important that you don't have it, and you want to address it if women are being excluded for things, or racial or ethnic minorities are being excluded, but it doesn't count in the definition of poverty per se, because that's a resource-based question. It's not, you actually also using this, you actually find out what people are excluded from or not, so you can actually use it to tackle those discriminatory questions as well if you run these kind of surveys. Right. It's now been used very extensively in the EU. It's become a standard measure of poverty across Europe. And our colleagues will talk later about how it's been used in Africa, the Americas, and as you see, widely ranged countries across the world now have used the method. And here's an example of a questionnaire from Benin. I put it up because you can see how it sort of relates to that kind of a low-income society where you're being asking about basic needs such as cereals and tubers every day, but you're also asking about their social needs, like being able to take part in celebrations, but also basic access to electricity, water, and things like that. So that's how the questionnaires will vary, but quite a lot of the questions will be the same as what you get in any country. We'll go back to that in a bit. We're starting to produce a database of all the questionnaires that have been done across the world. There's 45 countries that are going into the database. Then I have to say it's a work in progress. We haven't uploaded all the questionnaires yet, but what this will do is enable you to search all the questions that have ever been asked using this method across the world. You can search by the category, the kind of food, etc. Transport, to find out what questions have been asked in those. If you search by food, you'll get a subcategory of classifications, which enables you to pin down what particularly you're interested in, say enough food, or where it interacts with celebrations and things like that, or social obligations. So you can actually look at specific types of aspects that relate to food. If you clicked on 3 meals a day, you'd find the questionnaires that we've so far uploaded onto the system in different countries. It will tell you what language they're in, when they were conducted, etc. And you can then download those questionnaires as well. And it will give you the questionnaire in the language that it was conducted. So you can, if you wanted to pursue it, we have loaded a lot of South African questionnaires up. You can do it and you can find them in those languages. And this is a list of you can sort by country, whatever, to find out which questionnaires you're interested in. Okay, that's in development. It'll be up and running fully very shortly. So, looking across the world and the kind of the surveys, and what are the top conclusions we can draw from that? Well, I pointed earlier to the consensus we found in the UK across different groups in society. This we've found, you wouldn't necessarily expect it, applies across all the countries which we've surveyed. There is a very strong consensus between different groups in society what's important. So whether we look at gender, age, health, education level, etc., we find a very strong consensus about it's important to live in that society at that time. So here I'm to give an example of South Africa, obviously a very divided society in many ways, and what you'll see is that whether you're white, coloured, or black, South African, you have a very similar view about it. This is quite interesting because actually the black South Africans will actually, a lot of those items they will not have access to, but they know what the standard is for that society. The white South Africans will have access to it. So whether they have access or don't have access, they have similar views that they should have access. That goes, which is extremely important to observe. And I think one of the advantages of this method is it allows you to capture that. So the key things we found from these surveys in terms of what is necessity is that people believe that a minimum standard is not simply about subsistence. Most of the measures currently used for low-income countries are basically just about subsistence. But this isn't what is important to people. People live their lives in a complex way. If you only concentrate on subsistence, you don't capture what their lives are about. Indeed, you don't capture how they behave. They might choose to prioritize something which isn't a basic need, because actually their social obligations are more important to them. So they will spend their money or watch themselves on those things rather than basic needs. So you don't understand why they're not actually buying the food they need, because actually they think it's more important to fulfill their social obligations as that society. So you need to capture that range. We also find that people are relativists rather than absolutists. They agree about this view that things are relative to society we need. If you look to the UK, we found that as needs changed, so did as society changed, so did what people perceived to be needs change. So, for example, when we first asked the question back in 1983, there was no computers for people. There were no internet. It just didn't exist. Now we ask it for children, and everyone thinks it's an essential for all children to have. That's completely clearly obvious, because without that, they can't participate in school, they can't participate with their friends, they can't do their homework. So it's moved into being a necessity. So that reflects in how the method can reflect changes over time. So that's what I said. It backs contemporary standards. We have a wide view of essential. That's just repeating what I said as well, I think. And again, everyone should be able to participate in that. That's absolutely crucial. And that goes back, in a sense, to the Townsend definition about people being part of the society. And this is a way of which you can access that question. I just have a little look at a couple of range of countries. So these are percentage thinking a child item is necessary. And we've looked at a high income country, UK, Tonga, which is a more middle income country, Uganda, which would be a low income country. What you can obviously see from that is that if you ask that about children anywhere in the world, having the children properly fed is seen as a necessity. But equally, as you go down, there's fairly consistent views about what's important. Suitable space for homework. Uganda, it's lower than in the UK or Tonga, but it's still seen to be important by a majority. Now, what's interesting is we look at the percentages who can't afford those in those countries. In the UK, 3 meals a day can't be afforded by about 1% of the population. Tonga slightly more, but if you go to Uganda, a large percentage of the population can't afford that item. So you have a potential for a measure that can actually distinguish between these countries, as well as providing some kind of universal basis to that. Dave Gordon, I think, will talk about this more later, but it gives you even on these just basic top level statistics, without going into how you might control for them, you can see that actually you can see a wide variation between countries on things which all these items are things which the population in that country think they should have. They should be a necessity. So you can distinguish between high levels of poverty in low income countries and levels of poverty in high income countries. That's it.
Thank you very much. And I think that we go to the next presentation. The idea is to have at the end a discussion, because there are several things that I want to talk about, non-material deprivation, about children's and that kind of thing. So they are a question for you, but let's go with Héctor Nájera. Please introduce yourself. Forget to introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Please do. Yeah.
So once.
Put it like that.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Héctor. I'm part of the program for the development studies at the National University in Mexico. I used to work at the University of Bristol, and my research focuses on the use of different statistical methods to assess the degree or amount of error in a poverty index, but also in different social related indices. Today, I'm going to talk about the use of the relative deprivation approach in Latin America. And I will try to answer a very simple question, which is, do we need to move in Latin America towards the relative deprivation approach? And I will be giving you some context about why you might anticipate the answer. I believe that it will be useful to move towards the relative deprivation approach in Latin America. In the 1970s, and more formally, I will say in the 1980s, well, Latin America was at the forefront in multidimensional poverty measurement. There is this very famous paper drafted by Alberto and Luis Beccaria in the context of the Argentinian study to measure multidimensional poverty. And there were some other studies around, technical reports from the statistical offices. And this was due to some improvements in the coverage, the thematic coverage of the census data, but also in the household surveys. And basically, these improvements to the available data cover some aspects of basic necessities: access to education, access to key public services provided at community level, like water, electricity, sanitation, access to compulsory education, some questions about the materials of the house. Some surveys included some measures of durable goods and access to health services. This varied from country to country, but you have a core set of indicators. And back then, this was 40 years ago, it made sense. The connection between the ideas of poverty and this type of indicators was rather straightforward. We didn't doubt it that these were actually proper indicators to measure poverty. And many scholars identify this as the birth of the unsatisfied basic needs, the UBN approach. And this is important to bear in mind during the presentation. The UBN approach was widely used, I will say, in two senses. One was to develop the marginalization indices, which were area level indices. And I think this was because many governments, especially federal governments, wanted to implement local policies at community level, at municipality level, and so forth. And then you have the microdata to produce some household level measures. And these were poverty measures. And it's interesting when we think about this because we have two concepts, marginality and poverty, but both use the same data, which is something interesting to think about it. In measurement, you often have a concept, you generate data in accordance to that concept, and then you try to see the gap between the concept and the data you have, and then you estimate error. But something happened. There was a major structural adjustment throughout Latin America, as in many areas of the world. An income-based measure became more popular in the 1990s. And the UBN, some countries or some scholars in some countries computed the UBN, but it was less popular than in the 1990s or in the 1970s. But then, as Alberto mentioned in the introduction, in the early 2000s, there was this global study produced by UNICEF, led by Peter Townsend in 2003, based on microdata. And this allowed for the first time to produce child poverty measures for a large set of countries. And if you look at the indicators that were available in those surveys, were rather similar to the indicators that you had in the household surveys in Latin America, but also in many countries around the world. Then there was this period between 2004 and 2006 where Coneval, this is the official institution in Mexico responsible of estimating multidimensional poverty. And this was one of the first official multidimensional poverty measures in the world. There were some measures around, but this was basically in the Mexican law. And it followed the social rights approach. And then you probably know this, in 2011, there was this development from the capability framework tradition made by Sabina Alcar and Foster. They produced a couple of papers on counting and multidimensional poverty measure, and they launched the global MPI. And then there were other variants around of the UVN approach. And why I am classifying this as variants of the UVN approach? Because you have pretty much the same core indicators. In some cases, they added a couple more. For example, for child poverty, you have vaccination, food deprivation, for example. And even though the first one draws on the child rights framework, Coneval draws on the social rights framework, and then you have the capability framework and the other variants, all of these traditions use the same data to produce multidimensional poverty measures. Well, this is 2023. And there is an emerging disappointment with these measures for several reasons. If you think about probably the most developed Latin American countries, you're gonna find that a person who have all these items, not being deprived in all these items, some of them are still gonna be poor or be living in poverty. Because as Joanna mentioned, there's been some substantive changes in living standards in the region. Maybe in some countries, some of these indicators are gonna work better. And I'm gonna talk about that more in detail. The other issue is that most of these indicators are measured at household level. And well, there has been interest to measure child poverty, to try to approximate intra-household measures of poverty. So differences between men and women, for example, differences between old and young people. And if you have household level indicators, you are basically limited to make those types of comparisons. And if you look at the state of the literature 50 years ago, not many countries were adopting the UVN approach anymore, although some countries follow the MPI approach. So there is a mixture of the use of the UVN approach. And more recently, you have these counterintuitive results. This happened in many countries in the region. After the pandemic, if you compare the UVN results, poverty actually declined. And this is not something that you might expect after the pandemic. Why is that? Well, because some of those services are pretty much universal now, or they respond to the dynamics of social provision, which is good. But if you want a poverty index to make inferences about the effects of a major event upon the living standards of the population, you might want to have the expected direction between the event and the prevalence in the poverty measures. The other aspect that has been highlighted by the recent literature is this thing that I was mentioning, that data production must follow theory, not the other way around. And we have been using these data-driven measures, but for very good reasons, as I mentioned at the beginning, because most of the indicators made sense back then. And because of these reasons, there are a couple more, but these I think are the most important. Scholars from different traditions, even people that work, for example, with the OFI initiative to produce the MPIs, agree that there is a need for improve the measurement of poverty in the region. And of course, the question is, well, how can we do that? There is I mentioned this, but what is the actual status of the UVN measurement? Well, one of the predictions of Townsend's theory is that as the living standards change, well, some of the needs are going, or the indicators related to some needs, to those needs are going to become uninformative over time. And we can think about two hypotheses about this. The indicator become unsuitable to capture the relevant forms of poverty. And statistically speaking, that will mean that you will have an increase in measurement error. And we have done some empirical work on this. And basically what you find for the UBN-based measures in Latin America is that in some cases, you have a content validity. You have a framework that gives a definition of poverty, tries to relate unsatisfied basic needs to the concept of poverty. But when you look at the face validity of the indicators, most of the indicators are not working anymore, in the sense that the population say, well, yes, having water is essential, as Joanna was mentioning, but the depth of the needs in 2023 has changed substantially. And this translates to the level of measurement error. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But basically, there is not much evidence in favor to aggregating these type of indicators to try to classify the population, because it's telling very little about poverty at the present. And there is something really interesting. If you look at the indicators that have the lowest error, those indicators are pretty much those from the original list. And you end up having a unidimensional measure of poverty, not a multidimensional measure. Why is that? Because, for example, the MPIs, they are trying to add more indicators, but those indicators don't work very well. So it's better just to drop them if you want to produce an index, but you are going to end up with a unidimensional index, not with a multidimensional index. So there is an agreement about the need of having better poverty data that is representative of the needs of the Latin American population in the 21st century, and data that is derived from theory, not the other way around. And data that allows you to have poverty indexes with low measurement error, that is, indexes that allow you to have a clear idea of the profile of the poor, what are the socio-demographic characteristics of the poor, what are the location, what is the location of the poor, because what we have now is measures that allow us to identify the profile of the poor at the extremes. We know that indigenous populations living in rural areas are going to be much more likely to be poor. And when you disaggregate these indices, you basically say, well, this index is meaningful. But when you want to look at urban poverty, youth poverty, child poverty, you don't have enough information to do further quantitative work or further qualitative work based on the quite quantitative measures. So basically, inference is going to be bad about the moderate forms of poverty. And the other problem is that poverty is going to be severely under or overestimated. In most countries in Latin America, what we have is underestimation. The MPI, for example, for Mexico is around 5%. The official measure is now 37%. So there is a big gap, which is systematic error. And then policy evaluation becomes very, very difficult. Designing social programs becomes very, very difficult. So the first studies using the relative deprivation theory and the consensual approach, explained very well by Joanna, can be traced back to the early 2000s in Mexico. There was a small effort in Mexico City to try to assess the socially perceived necessities of the people living in the capital. And there were a couple of exercises throughout that decade. And most of these exercises focused on two things: have an idea of the socially perceived necessities of the Mexican population, and use the information of those studies to try to identify the thresholds for the available data. For example, there was a discussion about the threshold for access to water. Currently, the the threshold is piped water in the house. It doesn't matter if you try to open the tap and there is no water coming out of the tap. So the question is, what is the standard? Is the frequency now? What should be the standard? I mean, the population in Mexico pretty much say, well, water all the time, drinking water all the time. And recently, there is an exercise based in the context of the pandemic based on telephonic data, 2 rounds, 2020 and 2021, by the National University and the Ibero-American University in Mexico. And there's going to be a new one also from UNAM and the SEI, which is a think tank. They have a social mobility survey, and we are going to have data next year. There is also an exercise. This is the first official exercise in the region, which is for the city of Buenos Aires with the statistical office. The first one was conducted in 2019, and there is a new one published with data from 2002. And there is an ongoing project in Tucumán funded by UNICEF. And there is also a very recent project with the Cardiff University and the Campinas University in the Sao Paulo city, and the details have been published already. What are the findings of these studies? Well, Joanna mentioned some of these results. What you find, this is the prevalence of the response of considering each of these items as a necessity in Buenos Aires. But this basically replicates what we have found in the other exercises. Yes, most of the people say, yes, having water, having sanitation is essential, having access to health. But when you ask about the other things in the qualitative work, but also in the quantitative work, you see that the variety and the depth of the needs is very different. The thematic coverage has increased. And all the studies show that while the UBN measures are recognized as essential, the range of specific needs is more richer. In some cases, the domain is the same, for example, water, but the thresholds have changed. And there is very little variation across population. As Joanna showed, when you compare different population groups, you see that the endorsement rates are very, very similar. And empirical models, if you try to see whether there is some, from the statistical point of view, there is some multidimensionality in the data, you actually find that with the most recent methods that we have. For example, in the case of health, before we used to ask about access to health, and people say, well, but what about the medicines? What about the annual checkups for children? Those are now part of the list of necessities. Then we have the traditional UBN measures. In the case of education, we used to ask about whether children are attending to school, but now do they have books, or do they have the things that they need to go to school, to study, to do their homework, and so forth. The same in the case of the housing indicators. We used to ask only about the materials of the house, but now there is it's very clear that people want to live in a house that is warm, or that is or is cold when it gets too warm outside, where you have a table to have dinner with your family. And the same in the case of food, clothing, access to internet, and this aspect is very clear that it's very important for Latin Americans, the social aspect of deprivation and poverty, which are questions that are not in the standard surveys. Having a holiday once a year, the capacity to gather with your friends, to have dinner, and so forth. So what, from the statistical point of view, if we compare the results from the CA measures, the consensual approach measures, with what we have currently, when we use the UBN approach, the difference is very clear. The consensual approach leads to very, very low measurement error. If you use, for example, an MPI, it has an omega value, which is a statistic of the level of measurement error, which is often below 0.6. What will happen in those cases? Well, if you draw, for example, a poverty line here, you are going to be having high rates of false positives and negatives when you have this type of error. When you have low error, you basically can split the population really, really clearly, really, really well. So the poverty line is going to minimize the false positive and the false negative rates. So group distinction is better, and this is good because what we want to do when we measure poverty is to classify the population in at least 2 groups and then do policies about it and then track changes in poverty over time or compare poverty between different populations groups and so forth. There are some concerns about, well, the consensual approach seems to be rather subjective, as if the consensual approach were random. These are different things. You can have subjective measures that are not random. So we had this exercise with the Mexican data. We had 2 rounds where nothing happened between rounds. And you can compare statistically whether the measurement model, the parameters of the models associated with the indicators are the same. That's it. The hypothesis and the results were very, very clear. There were no reasons to believe that the results will be different. And this is what we found when we ran this statistical exercise. So how the poor are identified using this approach? Well, this is a very famous plot from Peter Townsend's 1970 book, where he the hypothesis is that if you plot, well, the hypothesis is that there is a level of resources from which deprivation increases dramatically. And this will tell you what is the best split between the poor and the non-poor group. This plot has been reproduced for most countries, even when you don't use the consensual approach and you have an index with low error. We have done this. This is for the Mexican data. This is the deprivation score. Once you have the deprivation indicators, you basically take the sum, simple sum. There are very good reasons for that, statistical reasons, but also because it's simpler to communicate. In the case of the child rights approach, there are very also good reasons of why this is the best practice. And what you find is, well, this population split, which actually approximates really, really well the value of the official income poverty line, which is based on a basket of goods and the value of that basket. If you do, this is not the same plot, but it's a similar exercise. You compare the income of the population. This is for the Buenos Aires measure. You're going to find a clear gradient about the relationship between multidimensional poverty and the level of resources approximated by income in the survey. So as I mentioned, and I'm just about to finish, unlike the recent implementations of the UBN approach with the relative deprivation, you actually have proper multidimensional measures. You can test that, and the results hold for all the countries that we have done this. And just to conclude, well, it seems that the relative deprivation theory jointly with the consensual approach, which is the method to collect and produce data, have the minimal conditions from what are the agreements now in measurement theory to produce good measures. It has a clear theory, it has a clear generation data process, and it has measurement evaluation. All the evidence suggests that the consensual approach has the potential to tackle some of these problems that we have with the current UBN measures, which is the capacity to explore the essentially perceived needs of the population in the 21st century, producing valid and reliable deprivation indicators, and having low error poverty indices. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Héctor. So, Mary, please.
So good afternoon, everybody who are attending in person and who are joining us online. Let me try to go to the first page. Yeah, so my name is Mary. I'm a researcher from Oxford University, and I joined Professor David Bowen's team for about 6 years and working on child poverty and also related issues, for example, food deprivation, food insecurity, malnutrition, and climate sensitivity and vulnerability. So I'm actually presenting on behalf of a huge team behind, like basically including every presenter here, and also Professor Shogunandi and Dr. Marco Pomati of Cardiff University. But unfortunately, they are unable to join us today due to other duties. So in this presentation, I'm going to share with you. Yeah, so we all know that the first SDG requires that, okay, by 2030, we should try to eradicate poverty in all forms and in all places. So that's our goal. And in order to do so, specifically the SDG 1.2 requires that, okay, we need better data, multidimensional poverty for both the adults and the children, according to the national definitions. And according to the previous presentations, we learned that the consensual approach could offer such a solution. It is a robust method. However, there are some criticism about the consensual approach based on something called the adaptive preference, and I'm going to explain the details in next slide. So basically, this group of like researchers or scholars, they argue that, okay, due to something called adaptive preference, and there is actually no social agreements about what is necessary for children, what is necessary for adults. And therefore, they challenge the fundamental assumption of this consensual approach to say there is no social agreements about necessities. So in this presentation, I want to share with you like 3 pieces of evidence from African to show you that no, actually, there is strong, robust social agreement about what are necessary for children, what are necessary for the adults. And also, this so-called adaptive preference phenomena does not affect the effectiveness of the consensual approach. So what is adaptive preference? And if you check online, like different researchers have different opinions, but generally it is characterized by, for example, changes in your self-perception or some even incorrect or inaccurate judgment about others' behavior or inaccurate judgment about some social standards, for example. And this list can go on and go on. So in our poverty research, these groups of researchers argue that, okay, so people who are born into poverty, who brought up in poverty, who live in poverty, they might have lower expectations about what they deserve or other people deserve in society. And therefore, people in poverty, they probably have a different opinion or perception of life necessities compared with other groups in the society. And I'm going to show you examples and evidence to argue against this adaptive preference kind of criticism. So this is our first study. I put a little reference here, so I can share with you after this. So published in 2020. And basically in this study, we used like data from 5 African countries as listed here. And as you can tell, each country could provide us population representative sample. So those are very high quality surveys. And each survey also lists a bunch of like multidimensional poverty items here. So as Hector and Joe already mentioned, those cover people's living conditions from different perspectives, including their access to clothing, food, housing, healthcare, transport, work, education, leisure activities, etc., etc. So each survey could ask people information according to those living standards. And those are living standard items are reasonable kind of multidimensional poverty measures. So in each survey, there are 2 questions relevant. Basically, the first question asks people, do you feel those items are necessary? And the second question asks people, do you believe you have those items or your household could afford for those items? And then we plotted people's responses across the 5 countries. So please pay attention to the red line here. This is our recommended threshold of the consensual approach. So if an item can pass the 50% of majority vote, it means that the item has the potential to be considered as a social necessity. Of course, need to go through the psychometric analysis as Hector just shared with us. So when we plotted these items here, we see that like for people in the 5 countries, they are the population representative samples. They almost all agree that the items listed on the left side should be like necessary for the household. And regardless how different like lifestyles or living conditions people have in those different countries, we see that it's the majority vote. The only exception is the case of eating cereals every day in Gabon. And we believe the reason was because this item got a data imputation from a third source. So, and that might not be appropriately weighted to reflect the population distribution. So that might explain this like surprising exception, but otherwise, like for all those other items, like people have the majority vote, they are important, necessary in life. And we further do a breakdown to check people's opinion according to their different age groups, educational level, ethnicity group, region they are living, or religional beliefs, or like urban-rural division. So let me give you one example to show you what we have been doing here. It's a bit hard to point, but let me show you. So item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, having more clothes to change. So this item, and you pay attention to this bar, it's a long bar here, and the left edge shows around 60 to 17% of one age group. I can't recall which one, but let's assume it's the age group 20 to 25, let's say. And in this age group, around like 65% believe that this item is necessary. And if you move to the right edge of this bar, and you can see that almost 100% of a second age group, let's assume it's the age group above age 65. And this age group, almost like 95% in this age group believe that this item is necessary. So for each bar, we try to plot it like the 2 edges are the 2 groups demonstrating the largest discrepancy, even though like the 2 groups might change depending on which item we are looking at. So again, as you can tell from the plot, the red lines indicating like the 50% agreement threshold. And then for almost all the items here, regardless people's slight different opinions of those items, they all pass the threshold, which means, again, like there are huge social agreements about which items are necessary or not. And again, this is a robust piece against the so-called adaptive preference argument. And the only small exception is, again, this item in different educational groups. And as you can tell from the second bar here, like one educational group think it is not that necessary. So the voting is around like 46, 45%. But otherwise, it's again, the majority agree like which are necessary in their societies. We further calculated the relative risk ratios between 2 groups, and we're focusing on 2 countries as shown here. It might be too small to read. So you might ask which 2 groups. We did 2 comparisons. So the first comparison occurred between 2 groups. The first group in the survey shared that, okay, they believed that they were living well, or they were living reasonably well. That's the first group. And the second group in the survey, they reported that they believe they live with difficulty. So this is the first comparison. The second comparison likewise happened in 2 groups. So the first group feel that they are the richest of their society. And then the second group feel that, okay, unfortunately, they were kind of at the bottom of their society due to whatever reasons. However, when we plot like the relative risk ratios, you can see that for most items, this number centered around the value of 1, which means that these groups are more or less having agreements regardless of their different financial or socioeconomic circumstance. So again, this is another kind of strong piece of evidence about the power of the consensual approach. And likewise, this time we focus on 3 countries and again did did 2 groups of comparison. This time is like household which can save and household which were in debt. This is the first comparison. The second group of comparison would be household, like people believe they have stable income, and people coming from households which they believe their household could not have like stable income. And again, similarly to the previous graph, you can see that most of the items, the relative risk ratios centered around value 1. So again, we did a similar practice, and this time we classified people into 2 groups according to the number of deprivations. So one group would be people who claim no deprivation among all those items. So for all the items listed on the right side, they have those items. And the second group would be people who lack 5 or more than 5 of the items listed there. So again, 2 kind of extreme groups in terms of their financial status. But however, if we plot their perception of necessities, we can see that again, it's the majority agreement, like all the items even past the 80% kind of threshold. So again, it demonstrates that regardless your financial situations, people do perceive similar situations, like they do perceive some items are important for both the adults and the children in their societies. Here is a second kind of piece of evidence from Uganda. And again, as you can see, probably just from the color, the heat map. So again, we asked about a bunch of like questions. What do you believe it is necessary for like children or your household or adults? And then again, regardless of people's gender or age groups, and you can see like people again reach agreements about those items. And this work was conducted in 2018 with collaboration with UNICEF. And again, we did a further breakdown between urban and rural, and all people living in different areas in Uganda, and again, like agreements to demonstrate that people do think, for example, 3 meals a day or 2 sets of clothing are important and necessary. Oops, sorry. And again, educational level, socioeconomic status, and monetary poverty. I think these last 2 columns are extremely interesting because again, it is directly against the so-called adaptive preference arguments. We see people who are in monetary poverty, but they do perceive social necessities exactly the same as the other groups in the society. So again, it's a strong piece of evidence. So the final piece I want to show you, and again, is in collaboration with UNICEF, but in 2018, and this time we focus on the refugees group and the host group. So if you read this table, we ask people, what's your perception of the items or activities you believe that are essential or necessary for children? And then there are 4 columns. So the first one shows the host group responses, and the last 3 shows the refugee group responses, but they come to Uganda in different time frames. So they stay like some less than 2 years and some more than 5 years. Regardless of those like situational differences, you can see that again, there are huge kind of agreements among those 2 groups, like the host group and the refugee group. And the items that are demonstrating like social agreements that people believe they are necessary, they can reflect the social reality, as I'm going to show in this page. So you can see that, for example, having own blanket, so both the host group and the refugee group believe that is necessary, okay, for the kids. And you see that 17% of the refugee group are deprived of this item, and 60% of the host group are deprived of this item. So for all those items listed here, you can see that the refugee group suffered more than the host group. It means that the social necessity items selected according to the consensual approach can really reflect the reality in Uganda. So conclusions, and I think 2 pieces of information are valuable here to share. So first of all, we believe that regardless of the diversity of people's characteristics or people in different societies, they might have different preferences, different lifestyles. We can come up with consensus about what are necessary for our case and for adults. And secondly, this consensual approach is really robust to help us achieve the SDG 1.2. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mary. Please, Björn.
So first, thank you for having me and inviting me to this seminar. I'm very honored to do that. My name is Björn Halleröd. I'm working at the University of Gothenburg currently in the Department of Sociology. And Dave asked me if I want to be part of this and present this since we were in New York together. And I said, yes. And what do you want to talk to? Let me be the devil's advocate, I said. And then I got this title.
We are waiting for that.
And now I have the daunting task to ask in favor of the adaptive preference ID, among other things. Let's see. Okay, it's all at once. Okay, let's see. You've seen the first one here from Peter Townsend. It's young Peter Townsend there, and you've seen the quote already, I think, from Joe. I think one thing that I want to start with, I didn't really plan, was I think when you read Townsend and much of things, it's clear that poverty is about lack of resources. And then Joe talked about how difficult it is to measure resources because they come in incomes, they come in kind, they come within the family, they come as services and so on. It's very hard to measure. But in my work, poverty is, and Hector mentioned, it's unidimensional. It is the consequences that are multidimensional. If we don't stick to the idea that it is the lack of the resources and access to resources, then it can be anything. But it is a causal relationship between the lack of resources and other aspects that makes it multidimensional in its consequence. So I think that's really important too. The other thing then is that Townsend said, well, the concept is understood objectively. And I think that is extremely important as well. It's not what people feel or so. But I think also, if I go where people criticize Townsend, was that he was in a way normative then. Even though you show this curve and the kink in the curve, whatever it's called, and say that's where we place the poverty line. He was heavily criticized for that. Is where actually do you want to have that line? And what item did he actually include from the survey from the beginning into the equation that calculated that line and so on? So I mean, he was in a way criticized for prescribing to the British population what poverty was, and so it was Townsend's poverty line, not the population's poverty line. Now you can think of what you want about that, but in a way that makes the poverty line normative, and I will come back to that because I think in essence it will always fall back, not what we measure, but where we draw the line more exactly will include some kind of normative judgments. I think that's inescapable. Anyway, the term relative deprivation, I think it comes from the beginning from Samuel Stauffer, this big work on the American soldier in 1949, where it actually, I won't take that story because it's too long. And then Davis in 1959 and Walter Rancheman in 1966 wrote about this. But you can actually find George Simmel already 1908 writing about the arme, the poor, and basically saying that this poverty is a social phenomenon. And and lack and discontent is a sort of phenomenon. You compare yourself with someone, and that's the importance. So I can't remember now if it's actually his Runciman or Davis quote, but they are very similar. So basically you say that, well, a person is relatively deprived if he or she want X, but doesn't have it, and see other people that has it at the same time. And so far, it's completely in agreement with Peter Townsend. And also you compare yourself over time, so you can compare yourself. You dwell into poverty and so on, and that's the feeling. But then you also have the third one, that you want it. And that is not accounted for by Peter Townsend, if you want it or not. But it's accounted for in the consensual approach. So it goes in there. And then they also say you should see it feasible, but you actually should have it. So for understanding discontent with a society and why people are upset of distribution and so on, which is important every time when we discuss poverty. The subjective relative deprivation aspect is really important. It's key to understand. And it's also key to understand when you try to redistribute resources, how people perceive the justice of the distribution that actually occurs. But we cannot use it for distribute resources. We cannot redistribute resources on a feeling. So I forgot to tell you about I remember that now when I saw the book. I had a book, I bought it very early. Last time I moved from my office, I threw it away because it literally fell apart in my hands. But being the devil's advocate, we made, it could have been one of the first replication of the British survey in 1992 in Sweden. So that was actually I constructed a survey for that, and then we did it in 1998, and then so it's not that I mistrust the method here, but so it's anchored in the objective relative deprivation, and I think it's really important is it makes it possible to adapt the poverty measure, and that is what Héctor talking about. So how to adapt it to changes in consumption pattern, and reflect it as social phenomena. And Joan mentioned that as well, because I think in small scale studies of what happens among people, social activities are extremely important. To be social integrated, to do what people expect from them, makes people suffer enormously when it comes to things that in a more objective way you should think is important. So it must be integrated. But of course, the consensual method incorporates part of the subjective social relative deprivation theory. And Mary, you talk about necessities then, and it does incorporate that, but it does on a collective level. So it's a mean for different groups. You don't ask a person, do you think this is a necessity, and then use that person's evaluation. So it's a mean. And I think the more basic it becomes, the more homogeneity you get, and of course the smaller standard deviation, because it's a function of the distribution in the binary distributions. So that's what you have. But you also have it is in the question, don't want and cannot afford. And then all of a sudden, it's on the individual level. Because you don't get a score on the index if you say that you don't want a thing. So, and in the essence of subjective relative deprivation, I think when you read about that, it's really that people, you cannot say that people work actively, because it's a motion that to work, it needs to work behind the back of the individual. That you say that certain things you don't want, because it's much easier to don't want them than to constantly want them. And I think we do that all the time. You want a fancy car, but no, not really. I want it's nothing for me. So, and you must believe it. Otherwise, it won't work. Otherwise, you will be deprived, subjectively deprived. So you cannot fool yourself in that. But it is on the individual level. And I will come back to that in the next slide. I also want to say another thing. Basically, when we did those surveys in Sweden, we had some items. And again, I think it's important to incorporate items in the questions that in a way capture what is going on in society and what changes in the society. Otherwise, we will not be able to measure that kind of exclusion that occurs as the society changes. So that's really important, but it's difficult to find the right items. So when we did this in 92, we asked about the VCR, and it scored very low, so it didn't add anything to them. And then, of course, just 6 years later, we didn't ask for it anymore because people start to use CDs. So it was, but we included mobile phone and we included home computer. And I remember also when we got criticized when we tried to present results from this, because critics looked at the items list and said, hey, now you're poor in Sweden if you don't have a home computer. I said, no, it doesn't score on the item. It doesn't add to the item. We just want to check if it does. And of course, now in 2023, if you go to the European Survey of Income and Living Condition, you basically ask not about the device. You ask about the social function of being able to access to the internet, and no one is questioning that. And then, and it also gives this really good indication of what we want to measure is what people need to be integrated and able to function in the society where they live. So that changes. Now back to adaptive preferences. To the left on that graph, the line is basically the Townsend line, saying how did they score on the deprivation index. We had a weighted deprivation index, but that's a technicality. And again, you see, you basically have that curve that you show in your graphs. And so when you increase in income, you quite rapidly go down to zero on the deprivation score. But you also had zero on those with the absolute lowest income, because we got the income from the tax return register. And of course, you can't live without an income, so they have an income, but the tax authority don't know that they have an income. But we know they have an income because they have all the items on our list. So that also is a good example of that. You actually need to measure what people actually can do and can buy and can consume, because we cannot really trust the incomes. The dotted line there is actually that if you say that you don't want something, it is that I don't have it and I don't want it. And then we also have a correlation with income, saying if the poorer you are, the more likely it is that you actually say, I don't want it. It is not a big, but it's there. And you can also see by age, the deprivation scores goes down, and this goes down because all the people, they say, we don't want these items. And it's more natural. But we could also show in the study that if you have an interaction of having a low income for a long time and age, it also increases the risk to say that I don't want. And of course, the things that I don't want is not food, it is not shelter, it is those items, that social items and mobile telephones and things like that. And just on the top of my head, I mean, if we really think seriously that we should try to capture things beyond what we call basic consumption of food and shelter and transport and so on, and social activities. What if we study a society where we have two dominant ethnic groups? One of those groups have quite extensive social obligations which cost resources. To be integrated, they need to do that. The other group, this is really hypothetical, they don't have that. Should we acknowledge then that group number one, they really need more. They need more economic resources. And you can imagine the political problem, you can imagine the discussion. So there is an issue there, I think. I don't know if it's a real issue or if I just made it up. But it's an empirical issue. And it also falls in that I think it's really important to include items that capture change over time in consumption patterns. Otherwise, we will end up in a situation. I think that's what a very good example you gave for that. And I also think that what we see and what the development since over time, and I think it was David Piachaud in the early 90s when he criticized Peter Townsend. I think the article is Peter Townsend and the Search for the Holy Grail, or just Peter Townsend and the Holy Grail, something like that. But I think he had one good argument, and that is that there is an absolute core in poverty. There is something that we really don't need to discuss. People need food, they need water, they need clothes, it's essential and so on. And if people living in a say that I don't want electricity, should we believe them? Isn't that part of the core saying, yes, we need that in the society? So, and we had that discussion partly yesterday, so saying, do we actually need to ask if it's necessary to buy clothes? Do we need to ask if it's necessary food and so on? And I think the answer then was, yes, it could be necessary because it gives a clear indication of the people sees this as a necessity. So it was like kind of a more of a political thing, or what to say, to communicate the method more than possibly to get the information we need, because we know that those things are necessities. And that last thing there I already said, I think, basically. And also think the concession method is really good then to see what to measure, to understand what is essential to put into the measures. Again, to measure this unidimensional phenomena with multidimensional consequences. To some degree, the necessity part help us also to understand how much and where to set the poverty line. But if the first one is empirical, we can find it out. The second one, where to set the poverty line, will always be a normative issue. There will always be a normative discussion. And go back all the way to Sibon Rantra in 1899, I think he made his survey in York, and he constructed the first income poverty line, the first food basket, household basket, I think, and explicitly saying that he put the poverty line at such a low level that no one could complain that it was too generous. Of course they complained it was too generous. And I think the specific item in the food basket that was most criticized, if I understand the historical sources, was that it included a cup of tea. So take away the cup of tea and you end poverty. But there will always be a discussion about the level, even though we have the items there. So there will be a normative question all the time, and we won't escape that. The consensual poverty line gives us tools to go a bit and add kind of objective information into that. But how much water? How many meals? What content in those meals and so on will be a normative question. And that will always be, we are always in a bit of a in the fog when it comes to that. And that's a picture from my balcony home in Gothenburg before I left. This is the weather we had. So,
Well,
thank you very much.
thank you, Björn. Thank you for the question and for doing advocate at the table. Thank you very, very much. We are accumulating questions for the end of our discussion. So they.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm David Gordon. I'm director of the Bristol Poverty Institute at the University of Bristol in the UK. And it's my job to deal with the devil and convince you the devil is not correct. Okay. So I'm going to talk about how you can scientifically measure poverty in a comparable way that can be used in all societies and to all groups in society, particularly children and adults. Okay, so I'm sure you all know the Sustainable Development Goals. The primary goal, the first goal, is to eradicate poverty everywhere during the 21st century and to leave no one behind. So the governments of the world agreed this in 2015, and they'd previously agreed it in 2000 as well. So the first time in the SDGs, the governments of the world also agreed that you should measure child poverty as well as adult poverty. So poverty wasn't just a household measure, it's an individual. Okay. So the question is, and this is the devil's advocate bit, can poverty be measured? It's a relative, dynamic, multidimensional. So is it possible to measure something this complex, or will it always remain in the eye of the beholder? So the US poverty line was established by Molly Oshansky in the 1960s. And she said some researchers believe that for deciding who is poor, prayers are more relevant than calculation, because poverty, like beauty, lies in the eye of the beholder. Poverty is a value judgment. It's not something that one can verify or demonstrate. It's entirely normative, entirely subjective. Yeah. She also defended the choices she made when developing the US poverty line, which is still used today for allocating large quantities of federal resources. She said, if it's not possible to state unequivocally how much is enough, it should be possible to assert with confidence how much on average is too little. I always thought this was kind of logically flawed because they're two sides of the same coin, but this is the basis for the poverty line for which you use your taxes to redistribute income in the US. So, is this argument correct? Is it mathematically possible to say how much is too little while not knowing how much is too enough? Well, it's very hard to put that in algebra and actually get to do that. And is she correct that poverty is always going to be subjective? You can never measure it objectively. Well, first of all, we need to go back to the origins of the poverty line. Is there an absolute core to poverty? If you look at historical texts or undergraduate textbooks, they give the impression that poverty in the past was always about prevention of starvation, that you had so little money, you basically couldn't survive, or you were starving to death. That is incorrect. Poverty, in certain terms of the English legislation, and there's legislation going back to the 13th century, was never about starvation. That was called destitution. Poverty was always about eligibility, ability to pay taxes, or the eligibility to get certain benefits. It was absolute core, did not exist in terms that you often see described. So here's an example from 1689, before income tax was invented. We had poll taxes where people, every man, woman and child, needed to pay to the king or queen to support their military adventures. And obviously you cannot get people to pay taxes if they don't have sufficient money. So in 1689, out of the 5.4 million people who were in the country at the time, 1.4 million children were deemed to be too poor for them to bother to try and collect the tax from. The overwhelming, there were some of 600,000 of those children, 600,000 people who were so poor they would become destitute if they weren't getting social security, of which half of those 600,000 were children, 300,000 people. But the overwhelming majority of poor children were in different categories. They were higher income level than the destitution, this absolute core that's sometimes described as poverty. So it was always about ability to pay tax. So the impression is given in undergraduate and sometimes graduate textbooks that the social researchers of the 19th century invented the poverty level. So you'll often see that Charles Booth, in his survey of London, invented the poverty line, and Seaborn Rowntree, in his study of poverty in York, perfected it by using budget standards approach. So Booth famously in the British Association said that the divisions here indicate the poor and very poor, necessary and arbitrary, but the word poor I mean to describe having a fairly regular or bare income, such as 18 to 21 shillings a week. That's about $1 an hour, I think, in modern day standard. For a moderate family to be very forceful. So this is the quote where people say Booth used this as income poverty level. Neither Booth nor Rowntree measured income. They never used that. What they used to define the poor was if they thought their researchers thought the family were living in obvious want or squalor. They were overcrowded. They were a dirty house. They didn't have many possessions. It's unknown how Booth arrived at the poverty line, but we do know the poverty line was invented by civil servants in local government because in 1870, the government decreed that all children should go to school. And children who were too poor to go to school, the local authority had to pay their fees. And so the poverty line was developed as a higher line than the destitution line for children in households where their parents couldn't afford their fees. So it was not about absolute want of the bare necessities of life. It was at a higher level about school fees, and that's the origin of the poverty line. It's integral to measuring child poverty. Booth's line of poverty, we're not quite sure where it came from, but it was twice the level of the poor law social security level, and very close to the level devised by civil servants for remitting school fees. So there was never this kind of absolute idea. That was a different concept. Poverty was always higher. Okay, so how do we do comparable global poverty measurement today? Well, there are certain things we need as prerequisites to measure poverty comparably in all countries of the world, from the poorest to the richest, from Liberia to Luxembourg. We need a theory and definition of poverty which is universally applicable in all societies. We need a method which automatically adapts to the realities of people's lives in those societies and communities. We need a method that can produce comparable estimates of the extent and depth of poverty, even where we use somewhat different indicators. You may need different indicators in poor African countries than in the US or UK. And you may need different indicators for children and old people that have different needs. And you need a method that produces demonstrably valid, accurate, and reliably and precise poverty measures, which isn't based on normative judgments, that you can show that if you use this, different people use the same method, you'll get the same result. Otherwise, why would anyone believe it? Okay, so a theory that's universal. Well, Townsend's theory of relative deprivation, which we've been discussing, is a scientific theory because it is applicable in all societies at all periods of history. You can apply that theory and get a measurement of poverty relative to that society and that societal norms. It's a sociological idea that there are certain universal needs that we all have for food, water, clothing, shelter, but we also have social needs to meet social obligations as parents, as children, as friends, as siblings. And those needs require resources. The exact way these universal needs are met varies from society to society, but they remain universal. So in Townsend's theory, a scientific definition of poverty is that poverty is defined as a commander over insufficient resources over time. So that's the amount of money you have, and the amount of wealth you have, and also the value of services you receive. And if you don't have sufficient resources, you will become deprived relative to the other people in your society. So poverty is the lack of resources. The outcomes of poverty, which are highly multidimensional and society dependent, are the deprivations. So Townsend invented these type of deprivation measures, at least in the modern form. And this is he in 1968-69 asked a series of questions which were applicable to British society at the time, and got the percent of people who couldn't afford these different items. He then plotted it, as we've already seen, showing that there was a certain point on the income scale where if your income fell below it, deprivation increased rapidly. As Björn has said, he was criticized for this graph. People said he was using funny graph paper, and if you change the axes a bit, you wouldn't get that kink. So in modern methods, we plot standard of living or deprivation against income, and we identify the optimal poverty threshold as the point which separates best separates the groups, the poor, the not poor, which maximizes the difference between them and minimizes the difference within them. So this uses standard statistical methods from the linear model, which we all use in regression and all those kinds of analysis. So the idea is the optimum poverty line is the point that separates the poor best statistically. Of course, the world isn't as simple as that. Poverty is not a static phenomenon, it's dynamic. Poverty is a very nasty situation, and people do their best to try and get out, escape from poverty. And in many countries, they often succeed. And therefore, if we have a dynamic model of poverty, at time zero, this person is not poor because they have a high income and a high deprivation. The way many people in many societies become poor is they have a catastrophic loss of income. The crops fail, they become sick, they can't work, they lose their job, etc. They will then, their income will fall, but their level of deprivation, their living standards, won't fall immediately because they'll have access to other resources. But if their income remains low for a long period of time, they will sink into poverty. The length of time it takes for their deprivation to increase depends on basically the social protection in that society. So in Sweden, it's much longer than in Benin, for example. In Benin or somewhere like that, if your income falls catastrophically, your living standards also fall rapidly, whereas in US or UK, it takes some months. At times three, that they're poor because they have a low income and low standard of living. The way people tend to get out of poverty is their income tends to increase quite fast. They get better and can work, or they form a new relationship. And it then takes some time to spend their way out of poverty, get the things they need to stop them being deprived. So if we go back to that graph, you can normally divide it into four groups, not two groups. You've got the poor, the not poor, those with a high income and a high standard of living, the poor, those with a low income and a low standard of living. But you've also got a group that's income has fallen and they're vulnerable to poverty. If their income stays low, they'll sink into the poor group, and a smaller group that's rising out of poverty. So this is the theoretical dynamic model of poverty that comes from Townsend's theory. So you can show on kind of Townsend style graph with deprivation along the x-axis and income along the y-axis. You can see that as income falls, there comes a point where deprivation increases rapidly, where we've drawn the line. That is the objective poverty line. So there's deprivation score of 3 and an income line, and this is for the UK, of £295. The group which has low income and low deprivation is the poor group. The group that has a high income and low deprivation is the not poor group. And then you've got the vulnerable and rising group. That, if people follow the methodology with the data, you will get the same result. There's no there's no judgment needed. Okay, so with the method which automatically adapts to measure the reality of people's lives, we've already discussed, which is the consensual deprivation method. This is a method where people are only defined as deprived if the majority of the people in their society say that these items are necessities of life, and the reason people don't have these necessities is either because they cannot afford them, because they lack the resources, or because they're not available in terms of services. The service doesn't exist. That method, because it depends on public opinion as well as statistical validity, is adaptive to any society. So, how do you produce comparable estimates using this method, given the vast range of differences of culture and society, the vast range of economic circumstances? So, deprivation and poverty are concepts, and the statistical term for a concept is a latent variable. You can't measure beauty or poverty directly, you can only measure it indirectly using indicators. The reflective measurement model is a model which assumes that indicators are causally related to this concept. So as poverty increases, deprivation gets worse, so the indicators will get worse. There will be more people who can't afford to feed or clothe their children. If poverty gets better, then there'll be fewer people who can't afford to feed their children. So the indicators are directly related. This idea has a number of useful properties in that you don't need to measure every possible deprivation to get a good estimate of the underlying deprivation or multidimensional poverty. And you can have, as long as you have a core set of indicators in common, you can have age-specific or country-specific indicators and still get a comparable measure by using scale equating methods which have been tried and tested over the past 100 years. You've all been subject to these kinds of equating methods if you've ever taken an exam. So the A grade this year should be the same as the A grade in previous years, even though the questions in the exam are slightly different. B grades, because they use these statistical equating methods where you've got a core set of questions, but other questions to align the results. So you can use these tried and tested methods with slightly different sets of indicators to measure deprivation and poverty in different countries and amongst different groups on a comparable basis. So you need, lastly, a method that produces demonstrably valid and accurate and reliable and precise poverty measures. So you need an analytical framework which can minimize both the random error and the systematic error in your measure. So you start with a set of indicators which the majority of the population agree are necessities, but you don't always take their words for it. You need to then take that set of indicators and select out the optimal subset which minimizes your measurement error. So random error is called reliability, systematic error is called validity. And then you can use the consensual method. It's used in the European Union in 28 countries when it was first used. It's used in 22 countries in small island Pacific states. This shows 2 middle-income countries in the Pacific, Tonga and Tuvalu, and a low-income country in the Pacific, the Solomon Islands. And without knowing anything about these societies, you can see that the deprivation in Tuvalu and Tonga are very similar. They have similar income levels, and deprivation in the Solomon Islands is far worse, both for adults and for households, and also for children. So, are these methods that I've been talking about? How reliable are they? How accepted are they? Well, the European Union has assessed them, as have the UN expert group and the Pacific Islands Statistical Community and the Conference of European Statisticians. Eurostat, which is the European Statistical Office, argues that these methods provide the gold standard and unanimously supported them in measuring deprivation for both adults and children across every country in the European Union. These measures have the force of law in the European Union, so they have to be passed through 40 legislatures, all of whom want you to prove that these things are valid and reliable in their country and will measure poverty. So this takes a little effort and answering several thousand questions. Yeah. So the way you take your subset of indicators which the population believes are necessities, have high face value, and then construct something which has a very low measurement error, which Héctor has talked about, is you make sure they're suitable. The majority say they're necessities. That you make sure they're valid, that they correlate with a priori indicators, which you know should be change with poverty. So whether people believe they're poor, whether they like to be in debt, whether their social class, what their education attainment of the head of household is, you can show that each deprivation indicator is a good correlation with these a priori indicators which we know relate to poverty. You can do reliability analyses to collect the subset of indicators which are have the lowest random error, and then you can do additivity checks to make sure that someone with a score of 2 is actually poorer than someone with a score of 1 or 0. I think for the European Union, with 28 countries and various social groups, we did 32,000 analyses to prove this. So you can start with a large number of potential indicators. There were 50 in the European Union survey of over 500,000 people in 28 countries in 46 languages. There had been an original deprivation index, and then a lot of these indicators are not reliable or valid for some subgroups in some countries, but you end up with a subset of indicators which are reliable in all countries, and you can do the statistics to prove them, and for all subgroups in those countries. However, there is always the political point that although you can measure poverty objectively, the purpose is to change it. Poverty is not party political. All politicians in all countries say poverty is a bad thing. They want less of it. No politician says we want more child poverty, but nevertheless, it is not always a priority. So here's a quote I like from What Should All Money Be Spent On, published by the Associated Press business reporter when Hugo Chavez died in Venezuela. She said Chavez invested Venezuela's oil wealth in social programs, including state-run food markets, cash benefits for poor families, free health clinics, and education programs. But those gains were meager compared with the spectacular construction projects, all which spurred in blistering Middle Eastern cities, including the world's tallest building in Dubai and plans for branches of the Louvre and Guggenheim Museum in Abu Dhabi. So not everyone shares the priorities that reducing poverty should be what money should be spent on. There are many valid criticism of Venezuela regime, but personally, I don't believe that's a good one. So I will leave you with the thoughts of one famous English scientist, Charles Darwin, who in 1845 said, if the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, then great is our sin. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Okay, so we are.
So thank you. My name is Enrique Delamonica. I'm Senior Advisor in UNICEF for Child Poverty and Gender Equality. So that means I spend a lot of my time thinking about these issues and working on these things. And Alberto, and I thank you very much for the invitation, put me an impossible task. I hope those online can see me. I don't have a PowerPoint. He wants me to talk about the future. And the future of measurement. And I was trained here at the New School in economics, and we had a model. The future is uncertain. So I'm not going to be able to tell you what is going to happen in the future with measurement. But there are three things I want to tell you, and that I can tell you. One is what I would like to see. What is my hope or my dream for measurement of poverty post-2030? I'm imagining that you said post-2030 because that's the SDG timeline. I have a forecast, quote unquote, inverted commas, forecast of where I think that's going to be after 2030. I might be wrong. And the third point I want to make is how to get there, how to get to that post-2030 measurement of poverty. You will see I will kind of change my tune a little bit as I go along. So pay attention. I hope I don't lose you along the way. So what's my dream? My dream are two, actually, for measurement of poverty post-2030. And they're both very simple in a way. One, I do hope that the internationally agreed way to measure child poverty post-2030 is based on the consensus approach. I think that's the way to go for all the reasons that have been explained here and many more. Second, I hope that besides poverty, we also measure quality of life, and in particular, the quality of life of children. And I think there is a difference between measuring poverty, and I think, Joanna, you mentioned this very clearly. I will not mention every person that talked before me, but I think all the points I make are related to those. But there are other issues, discrimination and social exclusion, which are also important, and we should measure them. So that's my dream or my hope. My forecast in a way is my nightmare. That's why I said I'm changing my tune a little bit. It's not my forecast, it's my nightmare. My nightmare is we're going to finally get rid of the $1 a day nonsense. Now you might say, if you applaud, then you think, why is that a nightmare? But my nightmare is going to be replaced by something worse. Because the World Bank knows that the $1 a day doesn't work, or at least doesn't work anymore because it's so low that they are running out of poor people. And that's not because we are succeeding the fight against poverty. It's just that the measurement was incorrect to begin with. So we have plenty of people, probably have more poor people than before, but we think that we're making strides in reducing poverty. The World Bank knows this. They're clearly trying to get rid of it. My worry is that they are still going to try to have something which is the same for everybody, but not really poverty in any conceivable sense of the word. And they might even try to do something mixing a weird line with some relative poverty, more about income distribution than poverty, and it will be a terrible mess. So that's one of my nightmares. The second thing that I think is going to happen, my sort of nightmarish forecast, is that the global MPI is going to be a measure, if not the measure, for poverty post-2030. And I say this not because I'm paranoid, which I might be, but that's not the reason why I say it. I say it because there are already elements and stakeholders pushing for this, trying to convince statistical offices to make the case in the respective fora, like the international group of experts that follow up on the SDGs and the meetings of the Statistical Commission, to make the case that because those countries are using the global MPI to measure poverty in their country, then everybody has to do the same thing. And if the past is prologue to the future, I'm afraid they're going to be successful. Which takes me to my third point. How to go closer to my dream and away from my nightmare. I think there are several things that we can do. First of all, I think we need to keep on working and striving to include the type of questions we need, and this is part of the things that you were saying, Héctor, consensus approach type of questions into the surveys. In UNICEF, we're working on that. We're trying to pilot and test questions about should everybody have this? Do you have it? Why not? Into the mix, the multiple indicator cluster survey that UNICEF runs. In that survey, there is a post-survey follow-up phone set of interviews. And there is where we think we can include some of these questions, because then we can rely on what has been asked before to do all sort of the kind of testing like Mary, you were doing, to get those answers and compare to the situation of those families. So I think that's something we need to do. Related to this, I think there are two other things we need to do. I think we also need to have better questions about the things that we're actually measuring now. Like, for example, we should have information about nutrition status for adolescents, not just for children that are 5. We should have information about the health situation of middle childhood, not just information about immunization for children under 2 years of age. And I hope I remember to come back to this point on my last point. If I don't, you remind me, please. There is another issue here, specifically related to children and the consensus approach, which is to ask the children themselves, or at least the adolescents, what they think is what everybody should have, or at least every child should have. There are ethical and practical difficulties in doing this. I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it. I think it's the kind of thing we need to be thinking about to move forward. The good thing is a lot of terrain has been covered on this, and you showed the number of countries where this kind of thing has been done. I think we need to document more of that. I think, Joanna, what you presented with a set of questions online is fantastic. I think we need to be writing way more books. I think we need to be posting way more blogs. I think we need to be writing way more journals. Because if you Google poverty, 1,000 to 1, you get the MPI. So that is work that needs to be done. And I hope that places like this and dialogue with academics and some people working in government, I think we have the opportunity to do some of this work together. The other thing where I think we need to do more work together that will help us to get where we want to get is to explore further the combination of poverty and the other issues that matter, or the other issues that matter to children, violations of child rights which are not driven by lack of resources. Going back to the point you were making, the bottom line is that we have to have these resources. So we should be measuring child poverty based on the consensus approach, but we should also be measuring the other bad things that happen to children, and we need to have ways to combine that. And this could be then the groundwork on which we can expand the discussion toward measuring social exclusion and quality of life. And I think we require amusing, on a personal note, if we replace the Bristol method to measure child poverty with the Bristol method to measure social exclusion, the work that was done a few years ago at Bristol University. Part of what we need to do to make sure that we have proper measurement of poverty post 2030 includes things that I think we should not do. We should not spend time on doing. And I say this with a little bit of trepidation because a lot of my colleagues do that in UNICEF. They run exercises where they try to show the difference between the MPI and some other way of measuring poverty. And they try to show that with one or the other, they get a higher number or a lower number. Which can be done. I mean, anybody that can get the survey, you can do it. The problem is they are not comparing apples with apples, they're comparing apples and oranges, because they have an MPI, which has a set of indicators and dimensions and thresholds, with a measure for child poverty, which has another set of dimensions, indicators and thresholds, and of course they have a different number. But it's not that we can say one is better than the other one, they just got a different number because they measure different things, which is not a very interesting conclusion, I would say. What is an interesting conclusion is the type of exercise that you showed about exploring the validity of the measure, exploring the reliability of the measure, exploring how the measure works for different subgroups of the population within countries to see if what we're measuring captures what we want to measure. I think that's the way to go. I'm almost done. 3 more things. The other thing we need to do is we need to engage, and this is part of of my work, but fortunately, I'm not alone. We need to train statistical offices. We need to work directly with the statistical offices. I think we need to provide for free education to staff at the statistical offices. We are working in UNICEF together with Paris 21, which is sort of the custodian agency for the SDG indicators that relate to strengthening data systems at the country level, to include statistics about children in the statistical strategies of the countries. And I think that's an entry point also to have this type of discussion about what we want to measure.
Now with Enrique Delamonica, and after that, let's have some discussion between us. Yeah. So,
Are you going to record it? Yes. No. No, you can record it. It's fine. So thank you. My name is Enrique Delamonica. I'm Senior Advisor in UNICEF for Child Poverty and Gender Equality. So that means I spend a lot of my time thinking about these issues and working on these things. And Alberto, and I thank you very much for the invitation, put me an impossible task. I hope those online can see me. I don't have a PowerPoint. He wants me to talk about the future and the future of measurement. And I was trained here at the New School in economics, and we had a model. The future is uncertain. So I'm not going to be able to tell you what is going to happen in the future with measurement. But there are three things I want to tell you, and that I can tell you. One is what I would like to see. What is my hope or my dream for measurement of poverty post-2030? I'm imagining that you said post-2030 because that's the SDG timeline. I have a forecast, quote unquote, inverted commas, forecast of where I think that's going to be after 2030. I might be wrong. And the third point I want to make is how to get there, how to get to that post-2030 measurement of poverty. You will see I will kind of change my tune a little bit as I go along. So pay attention. I hope I don't lose you along the way. So what's my dream? My dream are two, actually, for measurement of poverty post-2030. And they're both very simple in a way. One, I do hope that the internationally agreed way to measure child poverty post-2030 is based on the consensus approach. I think that's the way to go for all the reasons that have been explained here and many more. Second, I hope that besides poverty, we also measure quality of life, and in particular, the quality of life of children. And I think there is a difference between measuring poverty, and I think, Joanna, you mentioned this very clearly. I will not mention every person that talked before me, but I think all the points I make are related to those. But there are other issues, discrimination and social exclusion, which are also important, and we should measure them. So that's my dream or my hope. My forecast in a way is my nightmare. That's why I said I'm changing my tune a little bit. It's not my forecast, it's my nightmare. My nightmare is we're going to finally get rid of the $1 a day nonsense. Now you might say, if you applaud, then you think, why is that a nightmare? But my nightmare is going to be replaced by something worse. Because the World Bank knows that the $1 a day doesn't work, or at least doesn't work anymore because it's so low that they are running out of poor people. And that's not because we are succeeding the fight against poverty. It's just that the measurement was incorrect to begin with. So we have plenty of people, probably have more poor people than before, but we think that we are making strides in reducing poverty. The World Bank knows this. They're clearly trying to get rid of it. My worry is that they are still going to try to have something which is the same for everybody, but not really poverty in any conceivable sense of the word. And they might even try to do something mixing a weird line with some relative poverty, more about income distribution than poverty, and it will be a terrible mess. So that's one of my nightmares. The second thing that I think is going to happen, my sort of nightmarish forecast, is that the global MPI is going to be a measure, if not the measure, for poverty post-2030. And I say this not because I'm paranoid, which I might be, but that's not the reason why I say it. I say it because there are already elements and stakeholders pushing for this, trying to convince statistical offices to make the case in the respective fora, like the international group of experts that follow up on the SDGs and the meetings of the Statistical Commission, to make the case that because those countries are using the global MPI to measure poverty in their country, then everybody has to do the same thing. And if the past is prologue to the future, I'm afraid they're going to be successful. Which takes me to my third point. How to go closer to my dream and away from my nightmare. I think there are several things that we can do. First of all, I think we need to keep on working and striving to include the type of questions we need, and this is part of the things that you were saying, Héctor, consensus approach type of questions into the surveys. In UNICEF, we're working on that. We're trying to pilot and test questions about, should everybody have this? Do you have it? Why not? Into the mix, the multiple indicator cluster survey that UNICEF runs. In that survey, there is a post-survey follow-up phone set of interviews. And there is where we think we can include some of these questions, because then we can rely on what has been asked before to do all sort of the kind of testing like Mary, you were doing, to get those answers and compare to the situation of those families. So I think that's something we need to do. Related to this, I think there are two other things we need to do. I think we also need to have better questions about the things that we're actually measuring now. Like, for example, we should have information about nutrition status for adolescents, not just for children under 5. We should have information about the health situation of middle childhood, not just information about immunization for children under 2 years of age. And I hope I remember to come back to this point on my last point. If I don't, you remind me, please. There is another issue here, specifically related to children and the consensus approach, which is to ask the children themselves, or at least the adolescents, what they think is what everybody should have, or at least every child should have. There are ethical and practical difficulties in doing this. I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it. I think it's the kind of thing we need to be thinking about to move forward. The good thing is a lot of terrain has been covered on this, and you showed the number of countries where this kind of thing has been done. I think we need to document more of that. I think, Joanna, what you presented with a set of questions online is fantastic. I think we need to be writing way more books. I think we need to be posting way more blogs. I think we need to be writing way more journals. Because if you Google poverty, 1,000 to 1, you get the MPI. So that is work that needs to be done. And I hope that places like this and dialogue with academics and some people working in government, I think we have the opportunity to do some of this work together. The other thing where I think we need to do more work together that will help us to get where we want to get is to explore further the combination of poverty and the other issues that matter, or the other issues that matter to children, violations of child rights, which are not driven by lack of resources. Going back to the point you were making, the bottom line is that we have to have these resources. So we should be measuring child poverty based on the consensus approach, but we should also be measuring the other bad things that happen to children, and we need to have ways to combine that. And this could be then the groundwork on which we can expand the discussion toward measuring social exclusion and quality of life. And I think we require amusing, on a personal note, if we replace the Bristol method to measure child poverty with the Bristol method to measure social exclusion. the work that was done a few years ago at Bristol University. Part of what we need to do to make sure that we have proper measurement of poverty post 2030 includes things that I think we should not do. We should not spend time on doing. And I say this with a little bit of trepidation because a lot of my colleagues do that in UNICEF. They run exercises where they try to show the difference between the MPI and some other way of measuring poverty. And they try to show that with one or the other, they get a higher number or a lower number, which can be done. I mean, anybody that can get a survey, you can do it. The problem is they are not comparing apples with apples. They're comparing apples and oranges because they have an MPI, which has a set of indicators and dimensions and thresholds. With a measure for child poverty, we have another set of dimensions, indicators, and thresholds. And of course, they have a different number. But it's not that we can say one is better than the other one. They just got a different number because they measure different things, which is not a very interesting conclusion, I would say. What is an interesting conclusion is the type of exercise that you showed about exploring the validity of the measure, exploring the reliability of the measure, exploring how the measure works for different subgroups of the population within countries to see if what we're measuring captures what we want to measure. I think that's the way to go. I'm almost done. 3 more things. The other thing we need to do is we need to engage, and this is part of my work, but I'm fortunately I'm not alone. We need to train statistical offices. We need to work directly with the statistical offices. I think we need to provide for free education to staff at the statistical offices. We are working in UNICEF together with Paris 21, which is sort of the custodian agency for the SDG indicators that relate to strengthening data systems at the country level, to include statistics about children in the statistical strategies of the countries. And I think that's an entry point also to have this type of discussion about what we want to measure when we want to measure poverty for children. And once I think we do it for children, it can be expanded to the families and the rest of the population. My 5th point on terms of what we can do, and there are people here that work in the coalition against child poverty, like Equity for Children, I think we need to push this type of discussion within the coalition, because the coalition against child poverty was instrumental in the writing of the SDG target 122, which included the word children. It's multidimensional poverty for men, women, and children, which gives us a great entry point to measure specifically child poverty. And if we can leverage the coalition to make the case that when we measure child poverty, and hopefully poverty in general, we need to make the push in the fora that are starting to have these conversations about what to do post 2030. We need to include the consensus approach there. We need to do more work on that. The 6th element that I want to mention, which I think it's important to spread the word, is to do more work on policy analysis using the type of poverty measurement that we want to be used. Because one of the arguments that I hear repeatedly is that we use what everybody's using, like the MPI, because it's good for policy. It's good to inform what policies to engage in, which is rubbish. It doesn't do that. Or it certainly doesn't do it better than any other measure of poverty, because the only thing a measure of poverty does is to tell you how many people are poor. It's not telling you why they are poor. Now, there is work like this. Within the context of the European Union, there was a fantastic exercise on the macro and micro determinants of child poverty measured. Nobody knows that. When I know about it. When I try to look at it, to search for it, because I forgot where I store the PDF, I cannot find it in the website of the European Union. So we need to do more of this work. We need to publicize more of this work. We have, Alberto mentioned a handbook on which we're working. We have a chapter there that shows how, and actually we use some of your stuff on how Gender equality is one of the drivers of child poverty there. We need to do more of this policy analysis work using proper measures of child poverty to show that they are useful and that they are better than the alternatives. And this is where I stop.